We're ready to put the electronics in the kit. We're going to need the wire retainers and the bolts and servo retainers from the kit. We'll need 5 servos, 1 for gyro, in this case a fly barless unit, a receiver, a battery pack. We'll need a few extensions. We'll need a Phillips head screwdriver, an M2.5 hex driver, and a couple of different M2 hex drivers, and some cutting pliers, along with some tie wraps, some Velcro, and some foam tape. We're going to use various wire extensions, and I've also got some special clips I use to secure those extensions. How you do this isn't terribly important. It is important that you secure any connections so they don't vibrate off. I'm going to do something a little different with the power connections. Since I'm using an LIFE battery, it has an EC3 connector on it. Instead of using a switch, I'm going to use just a standard straight wire connector that I got from Fromco. It has an EC3 on one end, and it has 2 standard receiver connections on the other. That way, instead of having a switch that could fail, I'm simply going to plug these 2 connectors together when I'm ready to fly, and we'll be ready to go. Depending on what kind of power source you use, you're either going to have to use a regulator or high voltage servos. In this case, I'm going to use high voltage servos for everything except the throttle. In that case, I'm using a little Futaba step-down resistor that'll drop the voltage down to a little over 5 volts. Everything else we're going to run at straight LIFE voltage, which is 6.6 volts. We're going to use a GY750 as a fly barless unit and a Futaba 7008 S-bus receiver, which has telemetry in it. That way I can check the battery voltage just from my transmitter. That's why we're running, one of the reasons why we're running straight voltage instead of some sort of regulator. All of these servos are going to be installed with a graphite catch plate which goes on top of the servo. The connecting bolts basically sandwich the servo between this plate and the frame. Earlier we talked about the radio plate or the battery plate on the helicopter. One of the things we can do with that is if we can't fit everything on the front, we can put some of the components on the back. If you're running a regulator, this is a really great place to put it because there's plenty of room. In my case, I'm going to attach this splitter or this wire connector that lets me connect the EC3 on the Duralite battery into my receiver packs. So we're going to put that underneath, and then this just mounts back onto the helicopter as it did normally. If you want to make the assembly a little easier, if you take this tray off, go ahead and thread on some Velcro that you're going to use to attach the battery. Just put that in place, and then put some straps into the frame in the front slots because we're going to be strapping the battery and the fly barless control unit on as well. Now we can start installing the servos. We're going to start off with the pitch and aileron servos, which mount in the servo posts that attach to the main bearing blocks. A couple of points about this. The goal is to make sure that when everything's installed, the control rods that go to the swash plate are parallel to the servos, or they're basically straight up and down. In order to do that, depending on what kind of servo you have, the servo may have to move out or in. Well, if it needs to move out, we talked earlier about using these little graphite plates. They would mount between the servo post and the bearing block. Be a little bit of a bear to install them at this point, but you still can. If you're using JR servos, you're going to want to have put these in. Second, if for some reason the servo is actually shorter and you need to move it closer to the main shaft, there are additional spacers supplied that can mount beneath the servo or between the servo and the post. Remember, we're putting a plate on top of each servo mount to capture it. Well, you can also put one underneath it, which will push the servo out if you need to. Futaba servos, you're not going to need to do either of these things. So we start off with, this is going to be the pitch servo. It's mounted at the 10 o'clock position looking down at the swash plate. So the aileron servo is going to go on the other side. Okay, here you can see the aileron servo has been installed. So now we've got the front servos in place. We can put the elevator servo in place. It's a little different in that it's going to mount to the two aluminum posts. They're included with the kit. They mount in the same fashion. You use graphite servo plates on the top and then the aluminum plates on the bottom. Use blue thread lock, mount these in, and then this entire assembly will go into the chassis like so, and then mount in from the other side with M2 bolts. Okay, here I've mounted the elevator servo. You're going to use 4 M2.5 socket head bolts. They thread into the aluminum posts that we installed on the elevator servo earlier. I've also put the throttle servo in place. You can see it installs with the arm facing forward. Again, 4 2.5mm bolts. They thread into PIMs, so use some blue thread lock. Last servo to put in is the rudder servo. It's going to go in a similar way. We're going to use the flat servo retainers, plus there's 2 plastic blocks that come in the kit. We're going to put them on the servo like this, and it's actually going to go into this hole from the inside. When installing the rudder servo, you use the 4 holes that are in the back of the frame. They're cut specifically so you can access those mount holes. There's also a larger hole that you can get to both the center servo screw plus the ball link on the end of the control arm. We're going to put those in a later step. But for now, we've got all the servos in. Now let's put in the battery, receiver, and fly barless controller unit.